Halloween was always my favorite night of the year. There was something about the crisp fall air, the smell of rotting leaves, and the eerie glow of carved pumpkins lining front porches that made everything feel charged with excitement, and maybe just a little bit of fear. This Halloween felt no different. My friends and I had planned it out for weeks. The costumes, the route, and of course, the grand finale, heading up to the rich part of town for some legendary candy haul. There were four of us: me, Sam, Jesse, and Katie. We'd known each other since forever, but that night, we all had an unspoken feeling that this year's Halloween would be special. Sam, ever the risk taker, was the one who suggested going beyond our usual route to explore the neighborhood on the edge of town. We'd all heard rumors about it. The houses were massive, the decorations elaborate, and supposedly, the candy was the best in town. But there was something else people whispered about too. Something about the woods right behind the neighborhood, where strange lights were sometimes seen at night. I remember Jesse nudging me as we reached the neighborhood. "Dude, this is going to be epic," he whispered, his eyes glinting with excitement. Katie just rolled her eyes, though she couldn't hide her grin. Even though the houses were exactly as grand as we'd imagined, there was an odd sense of quiet around the neighborhood, as if the place was holding its breath, waiting. As we walked up to the first house, we noticed something strange. While there were a few carved pumpkins and decorations scattered around, many of the houses were unusually dark and quiet. We shrugged it off at first. Maybe people had gone to bed early. But as we moved from one silent house to another, an uneasy feeling started creeping over me. Then, just as we were about to give up on the candy hunt, we noticed a mansion at the end of the street. It was huge, surrounded by thick trees that bordered the backyard and led into the woods. In the faint light from a flickering lantern, we could just make out someone standing in the window, their figure shadowed against the glass. A strange, cold thrill ran through me as I saw the figure tilt its head slightly, watching us. Sam noticed it too. "Look at that!" he whispered. Pointing, Katie looked away, a little freaked out, but Jesse laughed. "Probably just some creepy Halloween decoration, right?" We turned to leave when something caught my eye, a faint glow coming from deep in the woods behind the house. It pulsed, a bluish light that flickered like a heartbeat. I felt my pulse quicken. Why would there be lights in the woods? The logical part of me said it was probably nothing, just some people hanging out. But curiosity pulled at me. "Are we seriously going to check it out?" Katie asked, crossing her arms. "Come on," Sam grinned. "What's Halloween without a little adventure?" The further we walked into the woods, the stranger things felt. The trees were tall and dense, blocking out most of the moonlight, leaving us surrounded by shadows. Every crunch of a leaf underfoot sounded too loud, and every breath of wind felt like it was carrying whispers from somewhere deep in the darkness. The glow was still visible up ahead, but now there were strange markings on the trees, scratch marks that looked too fresh to be natural. Symbols and shapes had been etched into the bark, and every now and then we'd stumble across pieces of Halloween decorations scattered on the ground. A broken plastic pumpkin, a fake spider web torn and twisted. I started to feel a little foolish for leading us here, but no one seemed ready to turn back. I think we all felt the same inexplicable pull toward the light. Katie gripped my arm tightly as a branch snapped somewhere nearby. "Did you guys hear that?" We froze, straining to listen. For a few seconds, everything was silent. Then, from somewhere behind us, there was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, a steady, crunching rhythm growing closer. I turned to see a dark figure standing among the trees, half hidden in shadow, watching us. "Run!" Sam's voice barely broke through the terror that gripped me, but it was enough to jolt us into action. The figure started to move, his steps quicker, more deliberate, as he began to chase us. Every time I looked back, he was closer. He didn't say anything, didn't make a sound, except for the relentless crunch of his boots against the forest floor and the snapping of branches in his path. It was like he was a machine, programmed for only one purpose: to catch us. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my legs felt like they were going to give out any second. Jesse stumbled and fell, but Sam and I grabbed his arms, pulling him back to his feet as we pushed forward, dodging trees and roots. The man's face was still hidden in shadow, but I could make out his eyes, cold, glinting, and fixed on us. He seemed tireless, while we were getting slower with each step. My lungs burned, and fear clawed at me, but somehow we managed to stay just ahead of him. I could see the edge of the neighborhood coming up. Safety was just a few more yards away. I pushed myself harder, refusing to look back, afraid that if I did, I'd see him inches behind me. Finally, we burst out of the woods, stumbling back onto the paved street. The lights from the houses felt like a shield as we gasped for breath, looking back to see if he'd followed us out of the trees. But there was nothing. Just the still, silent trees, the woods hiding whatever terror had chased us. We looked at each other, too shocked to speak at first. I think we were all trying to process what had just happened. Sam's face was pale, and Katie looked like she might cry, but none of us wanted to be the first to admit how scared we'd been. As we made our way back home, we walked in silence. There was an unspoken agreement that we wouldn't talk about what had happened, not yet. But I could tell we were all thinking the same thing. Who was that man? And why was he in the woods, waiting for us? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dark woods and heard the crunch of footsteps behind me. The terror had imprinted itself deep in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, somehow we hadn't really escaped. That maybe, somewhere out there, that man was still watching us, waiting for his next chance. Over the next few days, we didn't talk much about what happened. Occasionally, Jesse would bring it up, but none of us had answers to the questions that plagued us. Was it some elaborate Halloween prank? Or was there something more sinister lurking in those woods? So now I ask you, have you ever felt that eerie sensation of being watched? Ever seen something out of place that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up? We'd always thought we were safe in our small town, but that Halloween taught us differently. Sometimes, things we don't understand hide in plain sight, waiting for someone to find them. Would you have followed the light? And if you did, would you be able to turn back? Late one winter night, around midnight, I was alone in the house. Well, as alone as I could be with the wind howling outside, rattling the windows. It was one of those nights when everything feels just a little bit off. Even before anything actually happened, the silence inside felt thick. You know what I mean? Like a blanket, but one that's weighing you down, making it hard to breathe. I was getting ready to go to bed when I noticed an old, dusty chest tucked into the far corner of the living room. I swear I'd never seen it before. It was this heavy-looking thing, made of dark wood and covered in little scratches and nicks. It looked out of place in my living room, and yet it was there, as if it had always been waiting for me to notice it. Curiosity got the better of me. I crossed the room, the floor creaking under my feet, as if even the house itself wasn't sure about my decision to approach it. I bent down and ran my hand over the lid, feeling the rough wood against my skin. There was a chill to it, colder than the air around me, and it sent a shiver right through me. But I brushed it off. Musty old things have a way of holding on to the cold, right? The lid creaked when I lifted it, a long, drawn-out groan that made me wince. Inside, the first thing I saw was a layer of yellowed fabric, almost like a blanket or a sheet that had been thrown over something to keep it hidden or preserved. Beneath the fabric was an assortment of old trinkets, a tarnished silver spoon, some faded photographs, and an assortment of knickknacks that looked like they'd been there for decades, if not longer. And then there was the music box. It was small, maybe the size of my fist, and made of the same dark wood as the chest. There was a tiny brass key sticking out of the side, and, against my better judgment, I gave it a little turn. The gears inside whirred, and this eerie, tinkling melody started to play. It was haunting, sweet, almost like a lullaby, but warped somehow, like it was playing underwater. As the tune filled the room, I felt this overwhelming sensation, like I'd just opened a door I wasn't supposed to. The air felt heavier, colder. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this inexplicable urge to put the music box back and close the chest. But I couldn't move. I was stuck there, mesmerized by that haunting, broken melody. Then suddenly, there was a loud crash from upstairs, the kind that makes your heart leap right into your throat. It sounded like something big had fallen or been thrown against the wall. My whole body jolted, and I felt my stomach twist. Every instinct told me to get out of the house, but at the same time, I couldn't just leave. I had to know what was up there. Gripping the music box tightly in my hand, I made my way toward the staircase. Each step creaked louder than the last, and every shadow seemed to shift in the dim light. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, but I barely heard it over the pounding of my own heart. I reached the top of the stairs, and the hallway stretched out before me like a dark tunnel. The only light was a faint, flickering glow coming from under the door at the end of the hall. That room was supposed to be empty. I walked slowly, the floorboards groaning beneath my feet. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and every step felt like I was getting closer to something I didn't want to face. But that music, it was still playing softly in my hand, that distorted lullaby echoing down the hall as if the walls themselves were humming along. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand was trembling as I reached for the doorknob. It was cold, almost icy to the touch, and as I turned it, I could swear I heard a whisper, faint and indistinct, like someone trying to speak through a wall. The door creaked open, and I stepped into the room. Inside, everything was wrong. The air was thick, heavy, and it smelled of old wood and dampness, mixed with a faint hint of something metallic, like blood. The shadows clung to the corners, and it took me a moment to realize that I was standing in what looked like an old nursery. There was a crib pushed against the wall, a rocking chair beside it, and toys scattered across the floor. None of it should have been there. That room had been empty for as long as I could remember. I took a step forward, my hand gripping the music box so tightly my knuckles turned white. And then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound coming from the crib. I froze, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure whatever was in that crib could hear it too. But I couldn't turn away. Slowly, I stepped closer, inch by inch, until I was close enough to peer inside. At first, I thought it was empty. There was just a blanket, old and faded, lying in a crumpled heap. But then the blanket moved. I bit back a scream as I saw a tiny, pale hand reach out, gripping the edge of the crib. And then another hand, small and fragile, but somehow wrong. The fingers were too long, too thin, almost skeletal. And then I saw its face. It was like looking at a porcelain doll, perfectly smooth, with wide, glassy eyes that stared up at me with an intensity that felt all too real. But there was something missing, something hollow in that gaze, and as it stared at me, I felt a surge of cold dread wash over me. The eyes blinked, slowly, deliberately, as if whatever was inside was studying me. I took a step back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and suddenly, the music from the box in my hand stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me like a weight. And then, as if on cue, the doll, or whatever it was, sat up, its head cocked to one side, a slow, mechanical movement that sent a shiver down my spine. It opened its mouth, and what came out was a faint, distorted echo of the lullaby from the music box. But it was different now, broken, twisted, filled with a malice that I could feel in my bones. I stumbled backward, tripping over something on the floor, and fell hard onto my back. Pain shot up my spine, but I barely felt it. All I could focus on was that thing climbing out of the crib, its movements jerky, unnatural. It crawled toward me, its glassy eyes fixed on mine, that horrible tune still spilling from its mouth. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and backed out of the room. But as I did, I saw something else. Shadows moving in the corner, more of them, each one with those same glassy, doll-like eyes. They were all staring at me, unblinking, like they'd been waiting there all along. I don't remember how I made it downstairs. All I remember is running, tripping over my own feet, nearly falling as I hurtled down the steps. I didn't stop until I was out of the house, slamming the door shut behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stood outside in the freezing cold, my hands trembling, the music box still clutched in my hand. I wanted to throw it away, but I couldn't bring myself to let go of it. It felt like the only thing keeping that, whatever it was, at bay. And then as I stood there in the silence, I heard it again, that faint, haunting melody. But it wasn't coming from the music box anymore. It was coming from inside the house. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the dark windows. And as I did, I saw a small, pale face appear in one of them, staring out at me with those cold, glassy eyes. It raised a hand, pressing it against the glass, and I could swear I saw its lips curl into a smile. That was the last time I ever went back to that house. The chest, the music box, everything is still in there. I don't know what it was or where it came from, but I can tell you one thing. Whatever you do, don't go looking for it. Because once you've opened that door, it's never really closed. It was one of those quiet evenings. The sky was a soft blend of oranges and purples, and the warmth of the day was slowly giving way to the cool calm of twilight. I was sitting by the window with a book, enjoying the stillness. But then, my phone rang. It was my sister. Her voice sounded a bit off, like she was speaking from the end of a long tunnel, or maybe through a thin wall. I chalked it up to a poor connection, but something about her tone set me on edge. She said she was hearing strange noises in her house, small but persistent, like whispers and creaks coming from places where no one should be. She laughed it off, but I could hear the tension in her voice. There was a nervousness that I hadn't heard in her before, and I knew she was genuinely unsettled. She asked if I could stay on the line with her for a bit, just until she felt more at ease. "Of course," I replied, hoping my voice sounded reassuring. As she walked around her house, I could hear her footsteps echoing through the phone. She paused from time to time, her breathing steady but a little too careful, as though she was trying to avoid making any noise herself. I was quiet too, listening to the little sounds on her end of the line, the rustle of her sleeve, the soft creak of the floor beneath her feet, and then a sound. A faint, almost imperceptible thud coming from somewhere else in the house. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I said, my heart starting to race in my chest. "Where did it come from?" She hesitated. "The hallway, I think. But I just came from there. There's nothing there." We both fell silent, and a tense unease settled in. I was gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles were white, and I could only imagine the dread she must have been feeling on her end. She took a slow, careful breath and decided to check the hallway again. I followed every cautious step with her, each creak of the floor adding to the growing knot in my stomach. Then, as she neared the hallway, she stopped abruptly. I could hear her sharp intake of breath, followed by a chilling silence. I wanted to ask what she saw, but I was too scared of what her answer might be. Finally, she whispered, "There's someone here." My stomach dropped. I didn't know what to say, my mind racing with questions and fears. I waited for her to speak again, feeling utterly powerless. She continued in a low, shaky voice, "I can see something in the corner, a shape, but it's not moving. It's like it's waiting." The silence was unbearable. I was frantically trying to think of something helpful to say, but all that came out was, "Are you sure?" As if on cue, a loud, dragging noise echoed through the line, sending chills down my spine. My sister gasped, and then there was a thud, the sound of her dropping the phone. "Hello? Hello? Are you there?" I shouted, my own voice trembling now. The line went silent for what felt like an eternity before I heard her pick it up again. Her breathing was fast, panicked, but she was alive. I exhaled a shaky breath of relief. "I don't know what's happening," she managed to say, her voice breaking. "Every time I turn away, it moves closer. I don't understand. I just don't understand how." Fear gripped me as I tried to think of something, anything, to help her. "Listen," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'm coming over. Just stay where you are, okay?" I grabbed my keys and was out the door in a flash. As I sped towards her house, my mind raced with images of what she must be experiencing. Each bump on the road felt like it was connected to my pulse, pounding faster as I got closer. When I finally pulled into her driveway, I noticed something strange. All the lights in her house were off, save for one, the lamp in her living room window. Its dim, yellow glow seemed to flicker slightly, casting eerie shadows across the room. I dialed her number again, praying she'd pick up. After a few rings, she answered, but her voice sounded weak, distant, like she was somewhere far away. "Where are you?" I asked, desperate to know she was safe. She whispered, "I'm in the hallway. It's gone now, but I don't know if it's really gone. It just stopped moving." The weight in her words, the sheer disbelief, sent a chill through me. It wasn't over. Not yet. I stepped into her house, quietly shutting the door behind me, and called out her name. There was no response, only the creaking of floorboards as I moved down the hall. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, every flicker of movement a potential threat. And then, at the end of the hall, I saw her standing there, frozen, staring at the wall. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. She looked different, like something was keeping her there, holding her back from moving or speaking. I approached slowly, reaching out to touch her shoulder. The moment my fingers brushed her skin, her head turned ever so slightly, just enough for her to look at me from the corner of her eye. The expression she wore was hollow, devoid of the warmth I'd known my whole life. Are you okay?" I whispered, barely able to keep my own voice steady. For a moment she just stared, and then, in a voice that didn't sound quite like her own, she muttered, "It's still here. It's just hiding." That was the last thing I remember before everything went dark. I woke up the next morning in her living room, alone. She was gone, and there wasn't a trace of anything unusual. No signs of struggle, no mysterious shadows lingering in the corners. Just that same eerie silence that had been there the night before. Since that night, I've been haunted by my sister's voice. I tried to shake it, to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, that grief was twisting reality. But on dark, silent nights, her voice drifts back to me, like a whisper carried on a light breeze, soft but undeniable. It feels like a reminder, a quiet insistence that there's still something left unresolved. After she disappeared, I found myself returning to her house again and again, hoping to find some clue. But every time I crossed the threshold, the silence seemed thicker, darker. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the house itself knew I shouldn't be there. And yet, I couldn't stay away. On one of those visits, I arrived just before sunset. The house looked exactly as it had the night she vanished, down to the small details. The faint flicker of the living room lamp in the window, casting long, eerie shadows on the wall. As I stepped inside, that familiar chill settled over me, and I had the sudden sense that I was being watched. I moved cautiously, each step creaking as I made my way down the hall, retracing her last known steps. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something faintly metallic, almost like rust, that I couldn't quite place. I stood in the exact spot where I'd found her last, staring at that same section of wall where she'd frozen, unable to look away. But then, from somewhere deeper in the house, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. My heart began to race, but I forced myself to stay calm, to listen. It was her voice. I was sure of it. Faint, distant, but unmistakably hers, like she was calling me from just out of reach. "Come find me," the whisper echoed through the halls, chilling me to the bone. I followed the sound, my pulse hammering as I moved deeper into the house, into rooms I hadn't explored since she disappeared. Each step felt heavier, like something was pulling me down, holding me back. As I reached the doorway of what had been her bedroom, the whisper grew louder, closer. Steeling myself, I stepped inside. The room was untouched, everything was exactly as she'd left it, even the book she'd been reading still open on her nightstand. But there was something wrong with the mirror above her dresser. It seemed darker somehow, the glass almost fogged over, but not from dust or neglect. It was like something was moving beneath the surface, shadows swirling just out of focus. I stared at the mirror, feeling an odd compulsion to reach out and touch it. My fingers hovered inches from the glass, and as I hesitated, I saw something shift. A fleeting reflection, a face. Her face. She looked just as she had the night she disappeared, but her eyes were vacant, empty, staring right at me. Then, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere, she spoke. "Don't leave me here." Her words were pleading, desperate, filled with a sadness so profound it made my chest ache. But there was something else in her voice, a hint of something dark, something that sent a cold shiver down my spine. I tried to pull my hand back, but it was like I was rooted to the spot, my fingers inches from the mirror, unable to move. Her reflection leaned closer, her face twisting into something unfamiliar, something not entirely human. Her eyes darkened, hollowing out until they were nothing more than empty voids, and her mouth curved into a chilling smile. "Stay," she whispered, the single word echoing through the room. "Stay with me." At that moment, the mirror began to crack, hairline fractures spiderwebbing across the glass until it shattered with an ear-splitting sound. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, shards of glass scattering across the floor. In the broken fragments, I could still see her face, distorted and twisted, watching me from every piece. I didn't wait to see if she would speak again. I turned and ran, barely noticing the shadows shifting around me, dark shapes moving in the corners of my vision as I stumbled down the hallway. I could hear her voice behind me, growing louder, more desperate, like she was reaching for me, trying to pull me back. "Don't leave me. Don't leave me. Don't." I burst out of the house, slamming the door behind me, the echo of her voice still ringing in my ears. I collapsed onto the ground outside, gasping for breath, my hands shaking uncontrollably. In the years since that night, I haven't gone back. I moved away, far away, hoping to leave the memory behind. But no matter where I go, her voice still finds me. It's there in the silence of the night, in the shadows that creep along the walls. And every so often, I catch a glimpse of her face in reflections, in mirrors, windows, even puddles after the rain. As much as I tried to put distance between myself and that house, her presence has never truly left me. Days turned into months, and months into years, but I could never fully escape. Her voice, that desperate whisper, was always there, sometimes faint like a distant memory, and other times so close it felt as if she were standing right behind me. One evening I was at my apartment, cleaning up after dinner, when I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. Just a quick, fleeting shape reflected in the glass of my kitchen window. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, a shadow, my mind playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. This time I turned to face it directly, and I saw her, standing in the reflection, her face just as hollow and vacant as the last time I'd seen her, in the broken shards of the mirror. Her lips moved, forming silent words, and even though I couldn't hear her, I knew exactly what she was saying. I stumbled backward, the dishes in my hands clattering to the floor. My chest tightened, and my hands shook uncontrollably. I forced myself to look away, squeezing my eyes shut, hoping she would disappear. But when I opened them again, her reflection was still there, watching me with that empty gaze. Over the following days it got worse. Shadows lingered in every room, dark shapes that moved just out of sight. Her whispers grew louder, filling every silence, until I was hearing her voice in the hum of my refrigerator, in the wind outside my window, even in the rustling of leaves. It was like she was haunting every quiet moment, every pause, a constant, relentless reminder that she was still waiting for me. I knew deep down that there was only one way to end it, to go back to the house, to face whatever it was that had taken her. So on a cold, gray afternoon, I found myself standing in front of that house once more. It looked even older than I remembered, the paint peeling, the windows clouded with grime. I almost didn't recognize it, as though it had been abandoned for decades. The air was thick, still, and everything around me felt muted, like the world had been drained of color and sound. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The silence was absolute, oppressive, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Every step felt heavy, each floorboard groaning beneath me as I walked down the familiar hallway. The memories came flooding back, the fear, the confusion, the feeling of something watching me. When I reached the doorway of her old bedroom, I hesitated. The room was exactly as I had left it, every detail preserved, as if it were waiting for my return. The mirror above her dresser was still shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor, reflecting fragments of my face as I entered. I knelt down, picking up a piece, and in its fractured reflection I saw her behind me. But this time, she looked different. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, a deep, haunting sadness that made my heart ache. It was like she was pleading with me, silently asking for help. Her mouth moved, forming words that I couldn't quite understand, but I felt them like a weight in my chest. I whispered, "What do you want?" For a long moment, there was only silence. But then, in a voice so faint it was barely audible, she spoke, "Come with me." Her hand reached out, extending from the mirror, thin and pale, her fingers trembling. I stared at it, my mind racing, fear and curiosity clashing within me. Every instinct screamed for me to run, to leave and never look back. But another part of me, a part I couldn't quite ignore, felt compelled to reach back. Slowly, almost involuntarily, I extended my hand toward hers. The moment our fingers touched, a cold shock ran through me, and everything went dark. I opened my eyes to find myself standing in a different place. The room was the same, but changed. The walls were cracked, faded, and everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. The air felt thick, suffocating, and shadows danced across the walls, shapes shifting in the dim, unnatural light. And there, standing before me, was my sister. But she wasn't alone. Shapes surrounded her, dark, twisted figures with empty eyes and stretched smiles, each one bearing a faint resemblance to my sister, as if they were shadows of her, fragments of a memory. They watched me, silent, their gazes cold and empty. She stepped forward, her face filled with sorrow, and whispered, "I'm sorry. I tried to leave, but I couldn't. They wouldn't let me." The figures moved closer, their forms shifting, stretching as they reached out toward me. Panic surged through me, and I tried to back away, but my feet felt glued to the ground. I could feel their cold presence, the weight of their gaze, pressing down on me, draining every ounce of strength from my body. "Please," my sister said, her voice barely a whisper. "Help me." I struggled to respond, my voice trapped in my throat. But in that moment, I understood what she wanted. She was trapped, bound to this place, held by these shadows that had claimed her, and she needed me to break the hold they had on her. With all the strength I had left, I reached out to her, grabbing her hand and pulling her close. The shadows shrieked, their forms distorting, swirling around us in a frenzy of darkness. I held on to her tightly, refusing to let go, as the room spun around us, the shadows collapsing, melting into the walls. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The room fell silent, and the shadows faded, leaving only the two of us standing there in the dim light. My sister looked up at me, her eyes filled with relief and gratitude. She smiled, a small, fragile smile, and whispered, "Thank you." Before I could respond, she began to fade, her form dissolving into light. I watched, unable to move, as she disappeared, her presence lifting, leaving the room empty once more. I stood there in the silence, feeling an overwhelming mix of sadness and relief. She was gone, truly gone, but I knew she was finally at peace. When I left the house that day, I didn't look back. The whispers were gone, the shadows lifted, and though I still feel her presence sometimes, I know she's free, and that somehow she's watching over me. And I hope, wherever she is, that she's finally found the peace she'd been searching for all along. We were halfway through exploring the old, abandoned mansion when the first sign of trouble showed up. The place had always been a legend in town. Everyone knew someone who had heard the ghost stories. The strange noises, the mysterious lights flickering in the windows, shadows moving where no one should be. The house was huge, grand even, with that old Gothic architecture that looked like it was straight out of a horror movie. Its windows were broken, and ivy twisted up the sides, covering parts of the cracked, weathered stone. For years it had sat there at the edge of town, untouched, and that night, my friends and I finally worked up the nerve to go in. We moved slowly, trying to keep quiet as our flashlights bounced off the peeling wallpaper and dusty floors. The place had an eerie stillness about it. Everything seemed frozen in time, like the house was waiting for something. The air was thick and stale, carrying the faint scent of mold and something metallic I couldn't quite place. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I shook it off, blaming it on nerves. We were just about to head upstairs when we heard it, the unmistakable creak of footsteps on the floor above us. The sound was faint but deliberate, each step slow and heavy like someone was pacing. I glanced at my friends, and their wide eyes told me they'd heard it too. We froze, our flashlights flickering in the dark as we tried to stay as silent as possible. For a few moments none of us moved. Then another creak, closer this time, followed by what sounded like a quiet, dragging noise. My pulse quickened, each beat pounding in my ears. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady, but it felt like every breath echoed through the room, too loud, too obvious. "Maybe it's just the house settling," someone whispered, but even they didn't sound convinced. Just then, we heard a loud, resounding thud from above, like something heavy had been dropped. I felt my stomach twist, and a voice in the back of my mind started screaming that we needed to get out, now. I didn't even need to say anything. I could see the same fear on everyone else's faces. "Let's go," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. We moved quickly but carefully, turning back toward the entrance. Every step felt like a risk, each creak and groan of the floorboards beneath us, making me feel as though we were being hunted. I could feel a presence, something watching, waiting in the shadows, like the house itself was alive, urging us to leave, yet holding us back at the same time. My hands were cold, clammy, my flashlight shaking as I pointed it ahead of us, illuminating only a small circle of the darkness that surrounded us. As we neared the door, the footsteps upstairs grew louder, as if whoever, or whatever, it was had started following us, matching our pace. It felt intentional, like it knew exactly where we were and was letting us know it was close, too close. My heart raced, my mind torn between the primal urge to run and the fear that if I did, it would only get worse. We were almost at the door when something crashed to the floor just above us, the sound reverberating through the house like a gunshot. I felt panic welling up, my mouth dry, my hands trembling. Without thinking, I turned to look over my shoulder, hoping against hope that we were alone. But there, at the top of the staircase, a shadow lingered. It was tall, motionless, almost human, but somehow wrong. Its outline seemed to blur and shift, like it was a part of the darkness itself. I froze, my feet rooted to the floor, unable to look away. The shadow didn't move, but I felt its gaze, cold, piercing, as if it could see straight through me, right down to my very soul. My friend grabbed my arm, yanking me back to reality, and I stumbled forward, my legs feeling like lead. We burst through the front door, spilling out into the night air. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. We didn't look back, didn't stop until we were far enough down the road that the house was only a dark silhouette against the sky. Finally, I turned, expecting to see nothing, just an empty, abandoned house. But in one of the upper windows, barely visible in the dim light, I could make out a figure. It stood there, watching us, motionless. And as we stared, its outline shifted, blending into the shadows until it was gone. None of us spoke on the way home. We didn't need to. We all felt it, that sense of dread, the knowledge that we'd narrowly escaped something. And now, even as I lie in bed, safe and warm, I can still feel it, that presence, that cold gaze, like it's still watching, waiting, lurking, just out of sight, and I know, deep down, that I'll never go back to that house. There are some things you agree to do for a thrill, like exploring old, creepy houses with your friends, even though you know better. This particular night, we found ourselves in an abandoned, rundown mansion on the edge of town, a place that everyone knew was supposedly haunted. We'd heard the usual rumors, strange noises, flickering lights, a cold draft that seemed to follow you around. Of course, we didn't take them seriously. It was just a bit of fun, or so we thought. The air was thick with dust as we made our way up the creaky wooden stairs. Each step groaned under our weight, and every little sound seemed amplified in the silence. My nerves prickled with a sense of unease that grew heavier with each floor we climbed. Still, we kept going, laughing nervously and daring each other to keep moving, our flashlights casting long shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Finally, we reached the attic door. The door to the attic was old and scratched, with paint peeling off in chunks. It looked like no one had touched it in years. My friend Tony, the brave one, grabbed the doorknob and twisted, only to find it was locked. We let out sighs of relief, partly disappointed and partly glad to have an excuse not to go in. But as we turned to leave, a loud click echoed from the door behind us. The doorknob turned slowly, almost deliberately, and the door creaked open on its own, revealing a pitch-black room beyond. A chill ran down my spine. None of us moved. We just stood there, staring at that door, each of us frozen with a mix of shock and fear. It wasn't just that it had opened on its own, but there was something wrong about it, like the darkness beyond was waiting. Maybe it's just the wind, I muttered, but even I didn't believe that. The air was still, heavy and cold, too cold for a place that had been closed off for so long. One of my friends whispered, "Should we go in?" No one answered. We all just kept looking into that black void, our flashlights barely penetrating the darkness beyond the doorway. I took a small step forward, trying to convince myself that it was just an empty room, that nothing would happen if we took a look. But as soon as I moved, something inside shifted. It was subtle, just the faintest hint of movement in the shadows. I couldn't see what it was, but I felt it, a presence, something watching us from the other side. My heart started pounding, and suddenly I could feel the fear seeping into my bones. "We should go," I said, my voice shaky. "Now." But before anyone could respond, the door slammed shut, loud enough to make us all jump. Then, just as quickly, it creaked open again, swinging wide with an unsettling, deliberate slowness, like it was inviting us in. We all took a step back, exchanging nervous glances, the silence between us filled with an unspoken agreement. And then came the worst part, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from within the attic. It was a single word, drawn out and full of malice. "Stay." The sound of it hit me like a cold blast of air, freezing me in place. My mind screamed to move, to get out, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. It was like that voice was holding me there, wrapping around me, filling my head with a dread so deep I could barely breathe. Then someone, I don't even know who, yelled, "Run." That broke the spell. In an instant, we all bolted down the stairs, stumbling and tripping over each other in our rush to escape. I could hear my own breath, fast and ragged, mixed with the sounds of my friends' footsteps pounding against the old wooden steps. I didn't dare look back, too terrified of what I might see. The house seemed to groan around us as we ran, each creak and snap echoing louder than the last, as if it was coming alive, chasing us out. The air grew colder with each step, and I felt like something was right behind me, a presence so close I could almost feel it breathing down my neck. Finally, we burst out the front door and into the night. We didn't stop running until we were far from that house, the cold night air stinging our faces as we gasped for breath. We huddled together, each of us looking back at the dark silhouette of the mansion, none of us daring to speak. In that moment, I knew we'd all felt it. That something was in that attic, something that didn't want us to leave. And as we stood there, catching our breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was still watching, waiting for us to come back. We never spoke about it again, and none of us ever returned to that house. But sometimes late at night, I still hear that whisper in the back of my mind, chilling and relentless. "Stay." Alright, so this is something I don't usually talk about. In fact, I still get chills just thinking about it. I don't know if I'll ever forget that night. One of those moments that feels so surreal you keep telling yourself it must have been a dream, just so you can sleep at night. But it wasn't a dream. It happened, and every time I remember it, that knot of fear tightens in my chest all over again. It was just supposed to be a fun little ghost hunt with some friends. We'd done stuff like this before, going into old abandoned places just to see if we could freak each other out. You know, classic late-night adrenaline seeking. There were 4 of us, me, my buddy Max, his girlfriend Kara, and another friend, Ethan. It was a chilly autumn night, and the wind was blowing just enough to make everything feel a bit creepier than usual. The place we were checking out was an old, decaying mansion on the outskirts of town. You could see it from the road, looming in the distance, half hidden by trees that seemed to claw up at the sky. The locals had all sorts of wild stories about it, saying it was haunted or cursed, but we didn't really buy into any of that. It was just another spooky spot to explore. We parked down the road and made our way through the brush to get to the back door, which, like the rest of the place, was barely hanging on. Right as we stepped inside, I felt a cold draft that was somehow colder than the air outside. The house smelled damp, like mold and wood rot, and there was this strange metallic scent too, almost like rust. It was quiet, eerily quiet, like the whole place was holding its breath. We walked through the downstairs rooms, the light from our flashlights bouncing off the cracked walls and peeling wallpaper. Everything had a layer of dust so thick that it softened the edges of the furniture left behind. There was an old armchair covered in faded red velvet, a broken coffee table, and a huge cobweb-laden chandelier hanging above us. But for all the decay, nothing seemed out of place. It was like the house was preserved in its own way, untouched but still waiting. And then we heard it. A faint thud coming from somewhere above us. It was the kind of sound that makes your stomach drop, you know? Just a dull, heavy noise, like something or someone moving upstairs. We all stopped and looked at each other, our faces illuminated by the shaky beams of our flashlights. Max tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably an animal or something, but none of us really believed that. It was too deliberate, too human. We stood there in silence, straining our ears. That's when we heard footsteps, a slow, heavy tread, creaking on the old wooden floorboards above us. Step by step, like someone was walking from room to room. We didn't know whether to move or just stay frozen. I remember Kara gripping Max's arm tightly, her eyes wide with fear. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. Max whispered, "Maybe we should check it out? See if there's, I don't know, a squatter or something?" Ethan shook his head. "Man, no way. We're here to check the place out, not to get involved with whatever that is." But curiosity got the better of us, and reluctantly, we decided to keep exploring. We found a staircase leading up to the second floor. The banister was loose, and every step creaked loudly, echoing in the silence. I had this nagging feeling that we shouldn't go up, but there was also this weird pull, like the house was urging us forward, wanting us to see something. We reached the second floor, and I could feel the cold even more intensely. The hall was dark, with only our flashlights casting thin beams of light across the floor. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows in their frames, and every once in a while it made the old wood groan, like the house itself was breathing. The footsteps stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We checked the rooms one by one, whispering to each other in nervous voices. Most of them were empty, just filled with broken furniture and bits of junk. But each time we entered a room, there was this presence, like someone was watching from the shadows. We'd made it halfway down the hall when we noticed a faint glow under the door at the very end. It was so dim you could almost miss it, but once you saw it, you couldn't look away. The door itself looked sturdier than the others, like it had been recently reinforced. None of us wanted to open it, but it was like there was this invisible force drawing us closer. Max reached out, gripping the doorknob. It felt cold, colder than ice, and he hesitated for a second, looking back at us for reassurance. None of us said anything, so he turned it and pushed the door open. The room was empty, mostly. There was a single chair in the middle of the room, facing away from us. In the dim light, I could just make out the silhouette of something slumped in the chair, hunched over, like a figure hiding in the shadows. For a split second, I thought I saw it move. Then, as if on cue, the door behind us creaked shut on its own. We all jumped, spinning around to face it, and that's when we heard a whisper. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear, but it was there, coming from somewhere close. "You shouldn't be here." I felt every hair on my body stand up, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. The whisper sounded strange, like it was layered, multiple voices speaking at once. I turned back to the chair, my flashlight beam shaking, barely able to keep it steady. And in the darkness, that figure in the chair lifted its head. I saw a flash of something pale, but the face, it wasn't right, like it was blurred, shifting, as if it couldn't settle on a single form. Then the figure started to stand up, slowly, deliberately, and I swear I heard the sound of bones cracking, joints popping, like it hadn't moved in years. My friends and I froze, rooted to the spot, caught in some nightmarish trance. Just as it straightened to full height, the house around us erupted with sound. Footsteps thundered overhead, doors slammed shut in rooms down the hall, and a low, guttural growl came from somewhere deep within the walls. It was like the house was alive and furious. That was it. Instinct kicked in, and we bolted for the door. I could barely feel my legs as I ran, just this overwhelming need to get out, to put as much distance between us and that room as possible. I heard Kara scream behind me, but I didn't dare turn around. We reached the staircase, practically tripping over each other in our desperation to get down. The steps groaned under our weight, and I swear I felt something brush against my shoulder, a cold, fleeting touch that made me run even faster. Finally, we burst out of the house, gasping for breath, stumbling out onto the grass. We didn't stop until we were well away from the property, the house looming in the distance like a dark, silent monster. We all stood there, catching our breath, none of us daring to speak. The wind had died down, leaving only the deafening silence of the night. I glanced back, and in one of the attic windows, I saw it, the figure. It was standing there, watching us, its head tilted slightly, as if it were waiting for us to come back. The moonlight cast an eerie glow across its face, and in that brief moment, I thought I saw it smile. I've never been back to that house. None of us have. We don't talk about that night much, but sometimes in the quiet moments, I feel like I can still hear that whisper, cold and clear in the back of my mind. You shouldn't be here. And every time I hear it, I can't shake the feeling that the house is still waiting for us, patient, knowing that someday, somehow, we'll have to go back. I still don't know why we thought it was a good idea. Exploring creepy places always sounded like harmless fun, and we'd been on a few little ghost hunts before, but this night was different. Everything felt wrong from the moment we stepped into that house, like we were intruding on something we didn't understand. And I don't think any of us were ready for what we found. It was late fall, and a thick fog had settled over the neighborhood. The house we were checking out was old, really old. I'm talking faded paint, rotting wood, broken windows, the whole haunted house package. It had been abandoned for decades, and everyone in town had their theories about what happened there, none of them good. But as usual, we wanted to prove we weren't afraid. Just me, my friends Jamie and Leo, and our slightly braver friend, Sarah, who was the one who insisted we check out the attic. When we got inside, the place smelled like mold and damp wood, with that strange metallic tang that I always associate with old, abandoned places. We shuffled through the first couple of rooms downstairs, just old, empty spaces with dusty furniture draped in cobwebs. I could feel the floor creaking underfoot, and every once in a while, there'd be this loud groan from somewhere in the house, like it was settling around us. Eventually, we reached the stairs that led up to the attic. The staircase was narrow and dark, the walls pressing in on both sides as we climbed up, each step creaking ominously under our weight. Jamie muttered something about how maybe we should turn back, but Sarah rolled her eyes, leading the way with a flashlight that barely pierced the shadows. We finally made it to the attic door. It was old and scratched up, with chipped paint and a rusty knob that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I reached out to turn it, but the moment my fingers brushed the cold metal, the door creaked and swung open on its own. We all froze. I could feel my heart pounding, and I knew I wasn't the only one holding my breath. The air coming from the attic was freezing, and there was this horrible, sickly smell that wafted out like something rotting. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as the scent hit me. It was the kind of smell that clings to the back of your throat, making you feel like you can't breathe. Do we go in?" Leo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, but even she looked nervous. She shone her flashlight into the room, and for a moment I thought I saw something move in the shadows, but I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a trick of the light. Stepping inside, the smell grew stronger, almost overpowering. I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging. The room was small, cluttered with broken furniture and cardboard boxes that looked like they'd been left there for decades. And in the far corner of the room, something was slumped against the wall. At first, I couldn't make out what it was. My flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows over the shape, and as we got closer, I felt my blood run cold. It was a body, or at least it looked like one. The skin was pale and almost waxy, stretched tight over a twisted frame. The face was turned away, and there was something horribly unnatural about the way it was positioned, as if it had been abandoned there, left to decay. Jamie gasped, stumbling backward. "Oh my God, is that a body?" I couldn't speak. I could only stare, rooted to the spot, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Part of me wanted to believe it was just a mannequin, some kind of horrible prank, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. And then it moved. The hand twitched, just barely, but enough for me to notice. I felt my heart drop, every muscle in my body freezing as I stared at that pale, lifeless hand. Slowly, the figure's head turned toward us, and I caught a glimpse of its face. A hollow, sunken face with eyes that seemed far too dark, like bottomless pits. The corners of its mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile, but it was so wrong, so twisted, that I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. That was it. Without thinking, I turned and bolted for the door, practically shoving past my friends in my desperation to get out. I could hear their footsteps pounding behind me, and for a second, I thought I heard something else. A faint, shuffling sound coming from the attic, like the figure was following us. We tore down the stairs, tripping over each other as we scrambled toward the front door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst, and every step felt like it was taking longer, like the house itself was trying to hold us back. I could still smell that sickly, rotten stench, clinging to my clothes, to my skin, and it was all I could do to keep from screaming. We finally burst out of the house, stumbling onto the overgrown lawn, gasping for breath. I looked back just once, half expecting to see that twisted face staring back at me from the window, but there was nothing. Just the empty, dark windows and the faint sound of the wind rustling through the trees. We didn't talk much on the way back. None of us wanted to admit what we'd seen, what we'd felt. It was like some unspoken pact to just leave it behind and pretend it had never happened. But I can still see it in my mind, that face, those empty, staring eyes, and that twisted, unnatural smile. Since that night, things haven't been the same. I thought I could shake it off, push the memory away, but it clings to me like a shadow I can't escape. My friends and I don't talk about it, but I know they feel it too. You can see it in the way they avoid looking me in the eye when someone brings up haunted houses or horror movies. It's like we've all agreed, silently, that what happened in that attic is better left buried. But the feeling, it's always there. Sometimes I'll be alone, trying to sleep, and suddenly I'll catch a faint whiff of that awful, decaying smell, and I feel that familiar chill creep up my spine. I try to tell myself it's just my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I know better. The worst part is, it feels like that smell isn't just in my mind. It's lingering, real, like it's coming from somewhere close. One night, maybe a few weeks after we went into the attic, I was alone in my room, about to drift off to sleep, when I heard it. A faint, creaking noise, like a door slowly opening. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. It sounded exactly like the creak of that attic door, the same slow, deliberate sound that haunted my nightmares. I sat there, frozen, straining to hear anything else. My bedroom door was closed, but somehow I could feel a presence, something lingering just outside. After what felt like hours, I finally got the courage to check. I opened my door, peering out into the dark hallway. Nothing. But as I closed the door again, I caught a whiff of that smell, that sickening, rotting scent. My heart started pounding, and I backed up until I was pressed against the wall. I stood there, breath held, waiting for something to happen. But the room was silent, the smell gone as quickly as it had appeared. I tried to go back to sleep, but the unease stayed with me. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, thinking about that twisted figure in the attic, its lifeless eyes and unnatural smile. I could almost feel it watching me, waiting. Over the next few weeks, strange things kept happening. Little noises in the middle of the night, the sound of footsteps in the hallway when I was alone, and every now and then, that familiar smell, lingering just long enough to make me feel like I was back in that room. I thought I was losing my mind. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I'd seen that face in my dreams, and it was getting harder and harder to tell where the nightmares ended and reality began. One night, I finally snapped. I called Jamie and told him everything, the sounds, the smell, the nightmares. He was quiet for a long time before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was shaking. "It's not just you," he said. "I've been hearing things too. Sometimes late at night, I hear footsteps outside my window, like someone's pacing back and forth. And the smell, I smell it too. Every night." Hearing him say it made it all feel more real, more terrifying. We were all experiencing it, like we'd brought something back with us from that attic, something that refused to let us go. We started calling each other more often, checking in, trying to reassure ourselves that it was all in our heads. But deep down, we knew that whatever had been in that house had followed us, clinging to us like a dark shadow. Then, one night, I got a call from Sarah. Her voice was frantic, barely a whisper. "I think it's in my house," she said. I woke up and I swear it was standing at the foot of my bed. It didn't move, it just stood there watching me. I could feel my hands go numb as I listened to her describe the figure, its hollow eyes, the twisted smile. It was exactly what I'd seen, exactly what had haunted me since that night. I didn't know what to say, how to make it better. I felt completely powerless. After that call, things escalated. We all started seeing it, sometimes in our rooms, other times in reflections, like in mirrors or windows, just standing there, always watching, always waiting. None of us could sleep, barely able to eat. We were pale, exhausted, jumping at every little sound. It was like our lives had been consumed by that one encounter, like the thing in that attic had attached itself to us, pulling us back into that nightmare over and over again. One night, out of sheer desperation, we decided to go back to the house. We thought that maybe if we returned, if we confronted it one last time, we could somehow break whatever hold it had on us. It was terrifying, but we had no other choice. Living like this, in constant fear, was no life at all. When we got to the house, it looked even worse than before. The windows were darker, the shadows deeper, and it felt like the air itself was thicker, heavier. None of us spoke as we made our way inside, moving through the decaying rooms until we reached the attic stairs. With every step up those creaking stairs, my heart pounded louder, my hands shaking as I gripped the flashlight. Finally, we reached the attic door. It was slightly open, just like the last time, but this time, we didn't hesitate. We pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell was overwhelming, filling the air with that sickening, rotten stench. And there, slumped in the same corner, was the figure, exactly as we'd left it. But this time, it looked different. Its face was clearer, almost human, and its eyes were fixed on us, dark and hollow, but full of something that felt like anger. For a moment, we just stood there, frozen in fear. Then, slowly, the figure started to rise, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was pulling itself out of a deep sleep. Its mouth twisted into that horrible, twisted smile, and it took a step toward us. We ran. We didn't look back, didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for breath. But as we stood there, staring back at the attic window, I realized something horrible. The figure was gone. There was no one in the attic, no shadowy shape watching us from the window. But I knew, in my bones, that it hadn't stayed behind. It was still with us, closer than ever, and there was no escaping it. To this day, we don't talk about that night. I don't know where that figure is now, but sometimes late at night, I still feel it. We'd heard stories about this old mansion on the edge of town, a decaying place with vines crawling up its walls and cracked windows that gave it an almost sinister look. The legend around it was what drew us in. Supposedly, a young girl had been killed there decades ago, and her spirit still lingered, trapped in the house. I had always brushed off ghost stories as just that, stories. But this place, something about it felt different, even before we stepped inside. The air was heavy, cold despite the warm night, and as we made our way through the creaking front doors, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The mansion was quiet, with only the occasional groan of wood settling or the faint scurrying of something moving in the walls. Dust hung in the air, catching in our flashlights as we moved through the vast, empty rooms. The place had an almost eerie stillness, like it had been waiting for someone to enter, as though the walls were hiding some long-forgotten secret. We split up to explore, each of us drawn to different parts of the house. My friend Mark headed toward the basement, while Sarah went to check out the old library. I, for some reason I couldn't explain, felt pulled toward the grand staircase that spiraled up into the darkness above. Each step creaked under my weight as I made my way up, my flashlight casting long shadows that twisted and moved with every step. I was halfway up when I heard something, a soft, barely there sound, like a child's laugh. I stopped, holding my breath, straining to listen. The sound faded, replaced by the low hum of silence. I told myself it was just the wind, that old houses make all sorts of sounds, but I couldn't shake the goosebumps that prickled along my arms. At the top of the stairs, I found myself in a long hallway. Doors lined the walls, each leading to different rooms that I guessed had once been bedrooms. The air up here was even colder, and I could feel my heart starting to beat faster, a creeping sense of unease settling over me. I was about to turn back when I saw it, something glowing faintly at the end of the hall. A small green light, round and shimmering, hovering just a few feet off the ground. At first, I thought it was a trick of my flashlight, a reflection or some strange effect from the dust in the air. But as I walked closer, I realized it wasn't coming from my flashlight at all. It was a ball. A small green ball, like a child's toy, glowing with an unnatural light that made it seem almost alive. It sat in the center of the hallway, motionless, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. My chest tightened as I stared at it, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I took a step closer, and then another, the floor creaking beneath me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the ball rolled forward, slowly, as though it were inviting me to follow. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run, but something held me there, a strange compulsion I couldn't ignore. I took a few cautious steps forward, my eyes fixed on the ball, and that's when I saw them. Two small, glowing eyes, staring at me from the shadows at the end of the hall. They were faint, barely visible, yet unmistakable, and as I met their gaze, a chill ran down my spine. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink. They just stared, unblinking, cold, and empty, like they were studying me, deciding if I belonged there. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. It was like those eyes held me in place, trapping me in that moment, filling me with a fear so deep it felt like my heart would stop. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in that staring contest with whatever was lurking in the shadows. Seconds, minutes, maybe longer. Time didn't feel real. Nothing did. It was just me, the glowing green ball, and those eyes watching me with a silent intensity that made my skin crawl. Then suddenly I heard a whisper. A faint, barely audible voice, like a soft breath on the back of my neck. The words were too quiet to make out, but the tone was unmistakable, sad, pleading, and somehow full of anger. I felt a cold shiver run through me as the whisper grew louder, repeating the same haunting words over and over, filling the hallway with a sense of sorrow and loss that weighed down on me, pressing into my chest. Without thinking, I took a step back, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. The green ball rolled forward, stopping inches from my feet, and in the dim light, I thought I saw a shadowy figure standing behind it. A young girl, her face pale and hollow, her eyes as empty as the ones staring at me from the darkness. She was watching me, her expression blank, yet there was something in her eyes, a sadness and anger that chilled me to the bone. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare, frozen in terror, as the girl slowly raised her hand, pointing to the doorway behind me. And then, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from all around me, she whispered, "Why did you come here?" My pulse hammered in my ears and the edges of my vision blurred. I didn't have an answer. I didn't even know why I'd come. All I knew was that I needed to get out, to escape that cold, lifeless gaze that seemed to pierce right through me. With every ounce of strength I had, I turned and ran, sprinting down the stairs, barely noticing the way the walls seemed to close in on me, or the faint laughter that echoed through the house as I stumbled toward the front door. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I could feel those eyes on me, watching, following, as though the house itself was alive, hungry, wanting me to stay. When I finally burst through the front door and into the night, the cold air hit me like a slap, jolting me back to reality. My friends were already outside, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. It's strange, you know. No matter how much time has passed since that night, I can still feel her presence as vividly as if it happened yesterday. It's not the memory itself that haunts me, but the lingering sense that she's still there, waiting, watching. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I can feel that familiar chill creep up my spine, like she's standing right behind me, her gaze piercing through the darkness. I tried to forget, to shake it off, to convince myself that it was all in my head, but the memories keep flooding back. That green ball, glowing with an unnatural light, the soft, whispering voice, full of sadness and anger, and of course, those eyes, empty, unblinking, yet filled with an emotion so powerful it seeps into your bones. At first, I thought it was over. After that night, I stayed away from the mansion, avoided talking about it with my friends. But over time, strange things began happening. Little things at first. Lights flickering at odd moments, a cold breeze blowing through my room despite all the windows being closed. I tried to ignore it, but there was one thing I couldn't ignore. Every now and then, out of nowhere, I'd catch a faint whiff of that same musty, damp smell from the mansion. It was subtle, but distinct, filling the room like a reminder that she hadn't truly let go. One night, it got worse. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it, the faintest sound of a ball bouncing. It was slow and deliberate, each bounce echoing softly through the room, like someone was playing just down the hall. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to listen. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a car outside or some noise drifting in from the street. But as I sat there in the dark, the sound got closer, louder, until it was just outside my door. I held my breath, barely daring to move, every nerve in my body tense with dread. And then, without warning, the bouncing stopped, replaced by a soft, familiar whisper. The same voice I'd heard that night. "Why did you come here?" The words sent a chill down my spine, and for a moment I was back in that mansion, standing in front of her, those empty eyes staring into mine. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the blanket as tightly as I could, willing the voice to stop. And just like that, the room went silent again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the days that followed, I tried to act normal, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. The cold drafts, the flickering lights, that faint, lingering smell. They were all reminders that whatever happened that night wasn't over. It was as if the girl was tethered to me, a shadow lingering at the edges of my life, waiting for something. A few nights later, it happened again. I woke up to the same sound of the ball bouncing, but this time, it was inside my room. I could feel my heart racing, my body frozen in place as the sound got louder, the ball bouncing closer and closer to my bed. And then, just as it was almost beside me, it stopped. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, filled with a tension that made my skin crawl. And then I felt it, a cold, faint touch on my shoulder, light as a feather but unmistakably real. I gasped, bolting upright, and as I looked around the dark room, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner. A shadow, small and delicate, like a child standing there, watching me. I could barely make out her face, but those eyes, those unblinking, empty eyes were staring right at me. I didn't know what to do, so I did the only thing I could think of. I whispered, my voice barely audible, "What do you want?" For a moment, there was only silence. And then, the shadow tilted its head, her empty gaze never leaving mine. Slowly, she lifted her hand, pointing toward the window. I followed her gaze, my pulse racing, and saw it, a faint green glow hovering just outside like the ball from that night. I knew then that it wasn't just a coincidence, that whatever had happened in that mansion had followed me, attached itself to me. The realization filled me with a dread so deep I could hardly breathe. I turned back to face her, but she was gone, leaving only that lingering smell and an empty, oppressive silence. Since that night, the signs have only grown stronger. She appears more often now, in mirrors, in reflections, always in the corner of my eye, watching, waiting. And that same question echoes in my mind, over and over, like a broken record. Why did you come here? I still don't know what she wants or why she chose me, but one thing is certain. I can't ignore her anymore. It's like she's trying to tell me something, to pull me back to the mansion, to finish whatever started that night. And deep down, I know that one day soon, I'll have to go back, to face her, to understand what she's trying to tell me. Because until I do, she won't stop. She'll keep haunting me, lingering in the shadows, those cold, empty eyes following me wherever I go. And when that day comes, when I finally step back into that mansion, I know she'll be waiting for me, watching, ready to reveal the truth. But the question that haunts me now is, will I be ready to face it? I can still remember the sound like it was yesterday. It was a quiet, cold night. One of those nights when the world feels strange, almost unreal. I was staying at a cabin deep in the woods, hoping for a weekend of quiet and solitude. The forest stretched out in every direction, and there were no towns nearby, no neighbors, just trees and the occasional call of an owl or the rustle of leaves. I thought I'd love the silence, but something about the vast darkness around me made me feel small, like I was intruding in a place that didn't want me there. The day had been pleasant enough. I spent it reading by the fireplace, the only sounds being the crackling of wood and the wind outside. But when night fell, that peaceful feeling shifted. It's strange how a place can change so much in the dark. The silence grew thicker, heavier. It was a silence that felt like it was waiting, almost like it was aware of me, watching. I was sitting by the fire, reading, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling creeping up my spine. The clock read close to midnight. Outside, the wind had picked up, sending gusts that rattled the windows, adding to my unease. I was about to close my book and go to bed when I heard it, a faint, distant sound from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized it was different. It was the sound of someone crying, faint, soft, but unmistakably human, carrying through the trees and reaching me like a strange, ghostly whisper. My first instinct was to brush it off. I told myself it had to be an animal, or just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, who would be out in these woods in the middle of the night, crying? But as I listened, the sound grew clearer, filled with a pain so raw it sent a shiver down my spine. The crying was soft, almost fragile, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard, but couldn't keep it inside. I sat there listening, my heart pounding, a mix of fear and curiosity pulling me in opposite directions. I wanted to ignore it, to stay in the safety of my cabin, but something about that voice, it was like it was calling to me, asking for help, pulling me in. Before I knew it, I was standing by the door, flashlight in hand, hesitating. The sensible part of me screamed that this was a bad idea, that I should just lock the door and stay inside. But that cry, it cut through me, a strange, desperate sound that felt impossible to ignore. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone out there needed help, that I'd regret it if I didn't at least try to find them. So, against every instinct screaming at me to stop, I stepped outside. The air was icy, colder than it had been all day, and the wind seemed to carry the cries toward me, urging me deeper into the woods. I switched on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I walked, my steps crunching softly on the frosty ground. The cabin lights faded behind me, swallowed by the dense trees, leaving me alone with that haunting sound. As I moved deeper into the forest, the crying grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't steady. It would rise, then fall, like whoever was out there was on the verge of breaking down completely. Every step I took felt heavier, the dark shadows around me pressing in close, making the woods feel like a maze with no end. The trees loomed tall, their branches stretching out like skeletal hands, blocking out any trace of moonlight. The crying led me to a narrow, overgrown path that I hadn't noticed before. The air grew colder still, each breath hanging in the air like a ghostly mist, and the silence around the crying grew thicker, almost suffocating. I felt my nerves tightening, every instinct warning me to turn back, but something kept me moving forward. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, I had to know, I had to see. Finally, the path opened into a small clearing. The crying had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that settled over the place like a blanket. My flashlight flickered slightly as I stepped forward, scanning the trees, searching for any sign of whoever I'd heard. My breath was shaky, my heartbeat pounding in my ears, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones. And then I saw it. In the center of the clearing, partially hidden by shadows, was a figure. A woman, or at least the outline of one, sitting on the ground with her head bowed, long hair falling over her face. Her shoulders were hunched, and she looked so small, so vulnerable. I hesitated, unsure of what to do, but then I took a step forward. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strange in the stillness. Are you all right?" The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me at all. I took another step closer, and the beam of my flashlight fell on her face. But instead of finding comfort in the light, I felt a surge of terror. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes dark and empty, staring blankly at the ground as if she didn't even see me. And her expression, it was twisted in an agony so profound, so haunting, that I felt a chill run through me. The woman slowly lifted her head, her hollow eyes fixing on mine, and for a moment I felt like I was looking into the eyes of something that wasn't human, something ancient and filled with a sadness I couldn't comprehend. "Why? Are you here?" she whispered, her voice raspy, as though she hadn't spoken in years. I tried to answer, but the words caught in my throat. I felt paralyzed, unable to move, trapped under her gaze. The wind had died down completely, and the cold was so intense it felt like my skin was burning. All around me, the trees seemed to close in, the shadows deepening, stretching toward me as if trying to pull me in. And then, without warning, she started to cry again. But this time, it was different. The sound was no longer soft or distant. It was a raw, guttural wail, filled with a pain so deep it seemed to shake the very ground beneath my feet. I could feel her grief, her anger, pressing down on me, wrapping around me like a shroud. The urge to run was overwhelming, but my legs felt heavy, frozen to the spot. Her cries grew louder, echoing through the trees, and somehow I knew that I wasn't meant to be there, that I'd crossed into something far beyond my understanding. The air was thick with her sorrow, her rage, and I realized that I wasn't just an intruder, I was prey. In one desperate movement, I forced myself to turn and run, the shadows clawing at me as I stumbled back toward the cabin. The trees seemed to twist and shift around me, blocking my path, and I could still hear her cries behind me, growing louder, closer, filling my head with that same suffocating sense of despair. I finally burst out of the woods, my lungs burning, my body trembling. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it, every latch, every bolt, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. And then I stood there, gasping, listening. The forest outside was silent again, the night calm and still, as if nothing had happened. But I could feel it, that presence, lingering just beyond the edge of the trees, waiting, watching. Her cries echoed in my mind, a haunting melody that refused to fade, a reminder of what I'd seen, what I'd felt. Since that night, it's been impossible to shake her voice from my mind. Her cries echo in the quietest moments, always soft at first, like a memory, but then they grow louder, sharper, pulling me back to that frozen, terrible moment in the woods. I've tried to convince myself it was just a dream, a trick of the mind brought on by fear and exhaustion. But every time I hear that faint, mournful cry in the distance, I know I'm not imagining it. I left the cabin the very next day, packing my things in a hurry, barely able to stay in the house as the light faded. Driving back to town, I kept checking the rearview mirror, feeling like I was being followed. I thought the feeling would fade once I was back in the comfort of my home, away from the eerie silence of the forest. But it didn't. In fact, it only seemed to grow stronger. Every night, I'd hear it, the same faint, mournful wail coming from just beyond my window. It was as if she had followed me, carrying that same sorrow, that same deep sadness, right to my doorstep. And each night, the sound felt a little closer, like she was inching toward me, calling me back to her. One night, when the sound was so close it felt like it was inside my room, I couldn't stand it any longer. I opened my window and shouted into the night, "What do you want from me?" My voice cracked, echoing off the empty streets, but there was no answer. Just silence, thick and oppressive, like the entire world had fallen still, holding its breath. That night, I barely slept. I kept seeing her face in the shadows, those hollow eyes and that expression of profound sorrow. Every time I drifted off, I'd dream of the forest, of those twisting trees, and her figure sitting in the clearing, waiting, her voice filling the darkness around me. In my dreams, I'd try to approach her, to understand, but something always pulled me back, keeping me just out of reach. Days passed, then weeks, but the feeling didn't go away. It became harder to focus on anything. She was always there, lingering in the corners of my mind, her cries haunting every silence. And the worst part was, I started to feel her sadness, not just hear it, but feel it, like her grief was somehow seeping into me, becoming a part of me. I couldn't understand why, but I felt responsible, like I'd left something undone, like there was something I was supposed to do, and I'd failed her. Eventually, I realized I couldn't go on like this. I had to confront her. I had to go back. So one cold, foggy evening, I found myself back on the road, driving toward the cabin, toward the woods. The sky was overcast, darkening quickly, and the trees looked even more ominous than I remembered, their branches reaching out like twisted arms. As I pulled up to the cabin, a sense of dread washed over me. But I forced myself to step out of the car, my breath clouding in the icy air. The forest loomed in front of me, a wall of shadows that seemed to shift and move in the fading light. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to turn around and never look back, but I knew I couldn't. She'd pulled me here, as surely as if she'd reached out and guided me back. I made my way down the narrow path, my flashlight barely piercing the darkness. The trees closed in around me, casting long, eerie shadows that danced with every step. The silence was almost suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight, and with every step, the memories of that night came flooding back. And then, as if on cue, I heard it, the same soft, mournful cry, drifting through the trees like a song. It was clearer now, almost tangible, filled with a sadness so deep it made my chest ache. I followed the sound, my heart pounding, my hands trembling as I moved deeper into the woods until I found myself back in that same clearing. She was there, sitting in the center of the clearing, her head bowed, her shoulders hunched, exactly as she'd been that night. But this time she looked different. Her form was more solid, her presence heavier, almost real. The air around her felt charged electric, filled with a quiet intensity that made my skin crawl. I took a step forward, my breath shaky, and whispered, "Why? Why are you here?" She lifted her head slowly, her hollow eyes meeting mine, and for a moment I thought I saw something. Recognition, maybe, or a glimmer of hope. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out, and then in a voice so soft it was barely a whisper, she spoke. "Help me." The words sent a chill through me, and I felt a strange, unexplainable sorrow grip my heart. I didn't know how to help her, didn't even know what she needed, but I could feel her pain, her loneliness, like it was a weight pressing down on me. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely audible. How can I help you?" She didn't answer, but slowly she reached out her hand, pointing toward the edge of the clearing. I turned, following her gesture, and saw something I hadn't noticed before. A small, crumbling gravestone, hidden among the weeds and undergrowth. I walked over, brushing away the leaves and dirt, and saw her name engraved in the stone, along with a single date. My heart dropped as I realized what she was asking. She wanted to be remembered, to be acknowledged, to be seen. Somehow, in death, she'd been forgotten, abandoned, her memory lost to time, and her spirit had lingered here, trapped in the sorrow and loneliness of being forgotten. I knelt beside the grave, my heart heavy, and whispered, "I'm here. I see you." The air around me grew still, and I felt her presence shift, growing lighter, almost peaceful. When I looked up, she was standing beside me, her face softer, her eyes no longer hollow, but filled with a quiet acceptance. And then, as if carried by the wind, she began to fade, her form dissolving into the darkness, her sorrow lifted, her voice silent at last. I stood there for a long time, watching as the clearing grew empty, the weight of her presence slowly fading, leaving only the quiet peace of the forest around me. As I walked back to the cabin, the silence felt different, calmer, gentler, no longer heavy with sorrow. I knew then that she'd found her peace, that her cries would no longer haunt the forest. But sometimes in the quiet moments, I still feel her presence, a faint warmth, a gentle reminder of the soul that lingered. In the night I'd followed her voice into the darkness, to finally help her find her rest. There's something about old, forgotten rooms that always unnerves me. The dust, the stale air, the way shadows cling to every corner. It's like stepping into a place that's been waiting in silence, holding on to memories that no one remembers. So when I found myself alone in my grandmother's unused guest room, I could feel the weight of the years pressing down on me, filling the air with an inexplicable tension. The room was tucked away at the end of a long hallway, far from the warmth and light of the main living spaces. My grandmother had told me she hadn't opened it in years, that it was full of old things she no longer had use for. But I was curious, drawn to the mystery of what might be hiding behind the door. The second I opened it, though, I regretted it. The air inside was thick with dust, a heavy, musty scent that filled my lungs and made me feel like I'd stepped into another time entirely. The furniture was covered in sheets, pale and ghostly in the dim light from the single, narrow window. The curtains were closed, casting long shadows over the room, and everything felt still, untouched, as if frozen in time. I switched on the old lamp by the door, its weak yellow glow barely illuminating the room. The shadows seemed to shrink back slightly, but they didn't disappear. Instead, they gathered in the corners, heavy and dark, almost as if they were watching me. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine, and went about sorting through the boxes piled along the walls. Most of them were filled with old clothes, yellowed papers, little trinkets that must have once meant something to someone. But as I worked, the silence grew louder. It wasn't just quiet, it was a silence that felt purposeful, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. I could hear every sound I made, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of paper, like it was amplified. And then, in the midst of that silence, I heard something else. It was faint, barely audible at first, like a soft, distant whisper. I froze, straining to listen, my heart beginning to pound. The sound was subtle, like the breeze stirring leaves, but I was indoors. There was no breeze, no reason for a sound like that. I held my breath, every instinct telling me to leave, but curiosity kept me rooted in place. The whispering grew a little louder, almost like someone was speaking just out of reach. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, soft, almost pleading, like someone trying to be heard without being noticed. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the room was empty, just shadows and silence, watching, waiting. Trying to shake off the fear, I turned back to the boxes, telling myself it was just my imagination, that the old room was playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the whispering continued, a soft, insistent murmur that seemed to follow me around the room. It was like the walls were speaking, sharing secrets I wasn't meant to hear. Then the light flickered. The faint, yellow glow of the lamp shuddered, dimming and brightening as if struggling to stay on. In the brief moments of darkness, the shadows seemed to swell, stretching across the floor, reaching out toward me. I took a step back, my heart racing, and the whispering grew louder, closer, as if whatever was hidden in the shadows was drawing nearer. I turned, scanning the room, searching for any sign of movement. And then, in the far corner, where the light barely reached, I saw it. A dark shape, shifting, almost like a shadow but somehow more solid. It was tall, unmoving, and though it had no face, I felt its gaze, cold and penetrating, watching me with a silent intensity that made my skin crawl. My breath caught, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the boxes behind me. The shape didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence filling the room, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. The whispering grew louder, a faint chorus of voices overlapping, surrounding me, like they were all calling out, desperate to be heard. "Why are you here?" A voice whispered, clear and soft, sending a chill straight to my core. It was close, so close it felt like someone was standing right beside me, speaking directly into my ear. I spun around, but there was no one there, only the empty room, the dark corners filled with shadows that seemed to pulse, alive with a quiet, unseen energy. The air was colder now, almost freezing, and I could see my breath hanging in the air. My hands were shaking, and I could feel my pulse racing, the primal urge to run screaming at me to get out. I took a step back, my eyes never leaving the dark corner where the shape had been, but it was gone, leaving only the shadows, thick and impenetrable. The whispering faded, replaced by a silence that was somehow even more terrifying. It was as if whatever had been there was waiting, watching, deciding what to do with me. I moved slowly, inching toward the door, my heart pounding with every step. The light flickered again, and for a brief moment I thought I saw the shape reappear, closer this time, almost reaching for me. But the light steadied, and the shape was gone. With a trembling hand I reached for the doorknob, but as my fingers closed around it, I felt something cold, almost like a hand, brush against mine. I jerked back, stifling a scream, and looked around, but I was alone. My hand was ice cold, numb, and I could still feel the faint pressure of that touch, like a lingering reminder that I wasn't welcome here. I didn't waste any more time. I turned the doorknob and stumbled out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. The second it closed, the silence returned, heavy and thick, as if the room was content to be left alone once more. I stood there in the hallway, breathing hard, my heart racing, and for a long moment, I just stared at the closed door, waiting for something to happen, half expecting it to open again on its own. But it stayed shut, and slowly, the cold began to fade, replaced by the faint warmth of the rest of the house. Months passed, and the memory of that room lingered like a dark stain in my mind. I tried to move on, to brush it off as just a figment of my imagination, but the feeling of something unseen, something waiting, followed me around. I avoided the end of the hallway where the door to the room was, trying to pretend that part of the house simply didn't exist. But the strange feeling never really went away. One evening, my grandmother asked me if I could help her clear out some old things from around the house. I froze when she mentioned the guest room, but she didn't notice, her voice light as she went on about all the junk she'd been meaning to get rid of for years. She didn't remember the room the same way I did. To her, it was just an old storage space, forgotten and dusty. To me, it was the source of a creeping terror I couldn't shake. "Are you sure you need to go through that room, Grandma?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe it's fine just leaving it alone?" She gave me a strange look and laughed. "There's nothing to worry about in there, sweetheart. It's just a bunch of boxes, old clothes, knickknacks, and plenty of memories. Besides, a house like this needs a good cleanup every so often." Her words hung in the air, unsettling me. Memories. It was as if she sensed something I couldn't put into words, something left behind in that room. Against my better judgment, I agreed to help her, hoping my presence would at least prevent her from feeling the same terrifying presence I'd felt. As we made our way down the hall, I tried to brace myself, forcing calm into my steps. The hallway seemed longer than usual, stretching into a dim shadow, and every instinct in me screamed to turn back. But we reached the door, and before I could stop her, my grandmother twisted the doorknob and opened it wide. The smell hit me first, a stale, earthy scent, mixed with something faintly metallic, like old iron. My skin prickled, and I stepped back, feeling that cold, invisible pressure creep back into the air, the sense of a presence that hadn't faded since the last time I'd been there. But my grandmother seemed unfazed, stepping into the room with a soft hum as she moved toward the boxes stacked along the walls. I held my breath and followed her in, the room seeming darker than before, the corners deeper, like they were stretching into some unknown void. The faint light from the lamp on the dresser barely pushed back the shadows, and as I glanced around, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, just like before. As I reached down to lift a box, something caught my eye. In the corner of the room, near the spot where I'd seen that dark shape, there was a small dusty picture frame lying face down on the floor. I picked it up, brushing off the dust, and looked at the photograph inside. It was old, the edges yellowed and cracked. The picture showed a young woman, her face familiar but somehow haunting. Her eyes, even in the faded black and white photo, seemed to stare directly at me, filled with a sadness that chilled me to my core. I felt an eerie familiarity, a strange connection, as if I'd seen her before, maybe in a dream. Or perhaps, you found her, my grandmother said, her voice soft, almost nostalgic. She leaned over to look at the picture. "That's your great-aunt Helen. She used to stay in this room whenever she visited. Poor thing, she had a difficult life. I think some of her pain lingered here even after she passed." A chill ran through me, and my mind flashed back to that figure, that shadow in the corner, and the soft whispers that had filled the room. Was it her? Could it have been Helen's presence I'd felt that night? "What happened to her?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My grandmother sighed, her expression turning sad. She suffered from some kind of illness. The doctors never really knew what it was, but she always seemed distant, lost. She stayed with us off and on in her later years, mostly kept to herself. She passed away in this room, actually. I think she was searching for something, or maybe someone, right until the end. Her words sent a chill through me, the pieces falling into place with a sickening clarity. Helen hadn't just lingered. She was still here, trapped in this room, caught between worlds, her sorrow and loneliness woven into the very fabric of the walls. I glanced back at the corner, half expecting to see that dark shape again, but it was empty, silent. I placed the picture frame on the dresser, feeling a strange sense of duty, as if acknowledging her, recognizing her presence, was something she needed. We finished sorting through the boxes, and for the first time, the room didn't feel quite as oppressive. The cold air faded, replaced by a quiet stillness, and I felt a strange, gentle warmth, a presence, soft and sad, but somehow at peace. As I stepped out of the room, I glanced back one last time. The shadows seemed lighter, less threatening, and in the faint glow of the lamp, I could almost make out a figure, a woman, standing in the corner, her face calm, watching me with a gentle, grateful gaze. I shut the door, a sense of calm washing over me, and as I walked down the hallway, I felt like a weight had been lifted, like a chapter had finally been closed.